everyone. I'd like to welcome you to Leaning In and Speaking Out, the Research Connection podcast. My name is Jackie Kirk. I am one of the co-hosts of the podcast, and I am the chair of the graduate program in education at Brandon University and a member of the Department of Leadership and Educational Administration. This afternoon, I have a guest co-host. We have Dr. Shelley Kokorudz from the Department of Ed Psych and Student Services. No social services, Jackie.
I am the chair for the Ed Psych and Student Services Department here at the Faculty of Ed at BU. And right now, and I sit with Jackie on the Graduate Education Committee as the representative for inclusive education in our department. I am presently teaching principles of inclusive education to our present grad students, and in the fall I also teach theory of inclusive education. So the topic is dear to my heart, and I look forward to hearing more about Michael's research and what you're doing, and see how I can contribute. So glad to be here. Thank you, Jackie.
Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Baker. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Manitoba and also a K-12 educator, sessional lecturer at the U of M. I teach disability studies and inclusive education, and I'm a member of the Human Rights Committee of Council for the City of Winnipeg. I have red hair. I'm visibly a Jewish male, and I'm wearing a black hoodie today. I'm glad to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. So let's get started. Maybe you would tell me how you got interested in the topic of inclusive education.
Well, I have been, my journey with inclusive education kind of goes back to when I was a kid, because I was a rambunctious student. I was not a very attentive student. And so back in the early 90s, I feel like kind of the practice was to pathologize those children. And so I was immediately pathologized as learning disabled, with a significant intellectual disability. I was segregated from my peers, and isolated, and kind of forced to go through this process where I experienced ableism and otherization. And so school was not really a place of safety, was not something I enjoyed. And yet I had to go every single day, like every other Canadian child. And as I progressed through the system and got into high school, my mother, who was my biggest advocate, started to really push back. I had a lot of catch up to do because of that segregation. I was forced in high school to take what was called learning strategies, which is kind of like a pseudo course to segregate students. It was in a completely different wing of the school, down a completely different hallway. Only disabled students, quote unquote, would go down or could go down. And so, so I kind of had this growing up surrounded by ableist practices and kind of discriminatory viewpoints from the school. There was a lot of derogatory speech, and in my meetings that I would have, like as a kid, I remember 14, 15, sitting there with my parents, and resource teachers would say, Michael's just not smart enough to continue on in high school or to get certain credits. He should just go find a job. And so we kind of really pushed back. I worked really hard, upgraded my courses, and ended up graduating as an honor student. And that was actually frowned upon. It was really not something the school supported or wanted to see happen. But I ended up doing it anyways. And so I ended up going to university knowing that I wanted to be a teacher because of the negative impact that I had all the way through elementary school and then all the way through high school, which actually gets flushed out I'm writing an autoethnography for my dissertation, and so that kind of actually gets flushed out. And so I went to York University, knowing that I would probably always have this connection to the disability community. And so when I graduated and started to work, first I actually worked in an institution in Toronto. And then I got the opportunity to work in Manitoba, and almost right from, I think I only worked one semester in Manitoba. I've been teaching for 12 years here. I've only worked one semester where I wasn't connected to students with disabilities, and so since then I've always been connected to students with disabilities, and that kind of really kind of segues into my connection to inclusive education, in that I've always been in this special education or inclusive education world as a teacher as well. And so I have seen the progression, but I've also kind of seen the maintenance of the status quo of still kind of segregation, whether that's in curriculum or physical structures or attitudes. And so I've always kind of had this connection with inclusive education that perhaps emerged out of special education, right from a student and then all the way through my career. And then now I've kind of carried that through, and it's kind of brought me forward into my research. Coming out of high school, I would have never thought I would have done any graduate work. I wasn't interested in school at all. And so it's kind of really been, looking back, it's really been a path that I followed right from an early age, and I hope that throughout my career, throughout this journey, hopefully, things will improve, and we'll move forward.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for sharing your story. It's a powerful story.
Michael, I'm sorry to hear of your sad experience as a young person in school. And before we came on air, so to speak, Jackie was telling me a little bit about your research, and she put forward this big word that becomes part of my question, transinstitutionalization. Could you tell us what that means and what are its impact on students?
Sure. Yeah. Transinstitutionalization. It's not my term. I first encountered it in an academic journal, but what it is a term to describe the kind of cyclical nature of institutionalization without the bricks and mortar. So people with disabilities used to be institutionalized in institutions, in separate buildings. There was, you could locate them. And so transinstitutionalization moves beyond that to describe this idea of institutionalization without putting someone in a separate location. And so this kind of manifests itself in forced dependence on the government, on a system. And should you veer from that, there are significant consequences. And so the impact is actually very great on students, and it begins right from when they enter school. So right when a student enters school, they're quickly assessed and identified by a number of professionals, under the notion that should a student be identified as having a disability, that early identification helps to support that student, which is true, except for it's not the entire story. And so what happens is that a student, as a very young child, comes into the system in kindergarten and goes through these assessments and is identified, and then from those assessments and identifications, that student is tracked through the school system. And so that school system, as that child gets older, begins to work with government agencies like for students with disabilities, all the way into high school, where community living disability services gets involved. And so what actually happens is that as a school system, we track and sort these students, and we use things like IEPs and support intensity scale assessments, and perhaps the implementation of substitute decision makers in the school as they transition through and into adulthood. And when they transition into adulthood, the school plays a big part in transitioning students who participate in individualized or modified programming, who are considered by Manitoba Education and Early Childhood to be so intellectually disabled they can't benefit from curriculum, which I think is in itself an ableist statement, because every student, I mean, we operate under the notion in Manitoba that every student can learn, apparently, except for students with disabilities. And that's right on Manitoba Education's website. And so what we do then is we transition them to day programming. And what day programming is the old school kind of sheltered workshop. So we take these students, we track them from an early age, we move them through the school system, again, tracking them through with all types of different professionals, and then sending them off into a day program where they're meant to stay for life. They're meant to become wards of the state to maintain their benefits, to maintain any type of income support. And should they veer from that, should they want autonomy, voice, and choice outside of that system, all of their benefits are clawed back. Everything is reduced. And so what that school does is actually plays a critical role now in this institutionalization without the bricks and mortar. And we do a lot of that sorting and those assessments to make sure that those students fit nicely into the cyclical cycle of dependence, and that actually translates into adulthood with experiences like poverty. And really, unfortunately, we've seen medical assistance in dying become a prevalent way of, unfortunately prevalent in being applied to people with disabilities who don't have a terminal illness. And so what I actually see is a system just reproducing itself using the school system as a main funnel in maintaining this idea of institutionalization. And the public is not aware of it, and it's not discussed with parents. And when students who are going through this cycle graduate from high school, despite participating in the high school experience that is prescribed by the government, do not graduate with a high school diploma. They graduate with a certificate of completion, which lacks any formality, and it doesn't actually give them the same opportunities as everyone else who went through the high school experience. So a student who participated in individualized or modified programming can walk across the stage with all of their peers, and inside their envelope could be something the secretary created on Microsoft Word. It lacks all officialdom, and it actually excludes them systematically from attending college or university, and any job that requires a high school diploma, it would exclude them from that as well. And even more so, the system does not allow them to accumulate credits. So when you are participating in individualized programming, you cannot accumulate credits like the rest of your peers. There's no credit requirement because there's actually no graduation requirement. You're not graduating with a high school diploma. So what I see from all of these processes, not only in research but in practice, is we're just perpetuating this idea of institutionalization today in schools. And a lot of the colleagues that I have are completely unaware of this process. And so that's the short and long of it.
That is a really great explanation, and I think what I'm hearing you saying is we are historically, when we spoke about institutionalizing folks, we have taken them out of the brick and mortar, but we continue to institutionalize them in a different way, not necessarily a specific space, but in a different way of doing things. And
Right.
it's tremendous work. I look forward to hearing more about what you are going to come out of your PhD work with. And when we're done, I need to talk to you more about being a guest in my classroom. And the other thing I also want to say is I wonder sometime is maybe we know what's going on, but we don't stop to think enough about what we know is going on to make it matter. So, because it's just the way we always do things, right? And it's society continues to roll on. But I really appreciate the tension that you're bringing to the processes of how we do school. So thanks for that.
We talk a lot about systemic racism, for example, but we don't talk about systemic ableism. And we probably need to start generating more discussion around those issues. And yeah, I like that your research is bringing some of that to light. Are there some connections that you make to your own experiences or to your work in schools about what school divisions are doing?
So we're admitting that there are programs on the book that have negative ramifications for students. And to me, that blows my mind every time I talk with a colleague. And we kind of come to this agreement that, education carries out negative programs against, aggressives against students in public school. To me, that just completely blows my mind that we can come to this this conclusion, and yet our governing body, the provincial governing body, just maintains the status quo. I always look at designing with the end in mind. So if you design with the end in mind, we are designing and admitting to designing a system where we know that when a student with a disability enters and they're 5 or 6 years old, that we're going to make sure that they live in poverty until the day they die. And I can't believe that. I mean, I always find it, I always get so passionate about this subject because it's almost ubiquitous across the board. I've talked to so many people, pre-service, current teachers, senior administrators, and once we kind of all boil this down and talk about this more and more regarding individualized and modified programming and how we don't want to, it's better if a student gets a 50 rather than switch to a modified program because there's serious ramifications that could be lifelong. I mean, to me, that just shouldn't be. That should be immediately rectified. It almost seems like, to me, I've written about it, it seems like a charter infringement of the right not to be discriminated against based on disability. Automatically, we're discriminating against people with disabilities by saying, you don't get a diploma, you can't find a job if they needed a diploma, and you're not going to college or university. If you don't collect this type of support, then good luck. And I find it's such a hard pill to swallow. Studying the system, working in the system, it seems very, very drastic. I mean, if we took that same measurement and applied it to any other marginalized group, it would be devastating and publicized, and yet we continue as a country really to continue to perpetuate this ableist, discriminatory, oppression, and yeah, it's always a hard thing to hear and kind of realize.
I just will say, yes, I have been looking at some of the provincial documents myself, and I'm waiting for those things to come out. But, the language around inclusion in some of the documents that are in current existence, we still have a special ed certificate, right? When we are we haven't even changed that language over to an inclusive education certificate. It's or a degree in inclusive ed. It's still labeled or termed special education, even though here in the faculty we have changed it over to inclusive ed, but we're still waiting for the province to catch up even on that language. So lots of things perpetuate the way we always do things, even though we're trying to move towards the language. But yeah, really interesting discussion. But anyway, from a curriculum or pedagogical perspective, or maybe even both, what would you like to see future teachers do in the classroom? And how can we as teacher educators equip them to do these things?
Okay. Well, what you did is ask a very big question. And of course, I don't have all the solutions. Um, but a great starter would be to scrap this idea that students participating in individualized and modified programming don't get a high school diploma. That should be route number one. Second of all is um, in terms of the teacher pushback that you were talking about, what you're actually talking about is not a problem necessarily with the student or with the teacher. It's actually a funding problem. So what it's putting you in a bad situation, because what's actually happening is the government isn't adequately funding education, just like they don't adequately fund healthcare, and then seem surprised when that reaches a breaking point. And so what we're talking about there is a funding problem, right? We're talking about putting our money where our priorities are. And frontline services like education and healthcare should be front and center. We should be funding them. And so the solution, obviously, from that perspective, is a systems problem and a systems solution. It's not an education problem. It's a funding problem, right? We need to have more supports all the way through education, from an early start all the way through. And I think a lot of that pushback gets solved, but it's always context specific, and there are always going to be unique situations. So, like, not all teacher pushback or all challenges can ever be solved, but I do think that it's a systems problem when you have a very full class and you begin to have kind of different perceived behavioral issues because of the surroundings or the environment. So there's that. So yeah, what I'd like to see, teachers I'd like to see disability studies taught. I'd like to see teachers understand, expertise and research from a disability perspective, which is completely left out of not only pre-service teacher programs, usually. I know that's changing, so it can't be a blanket statement. But then also see it with teachers currently, implemented in professional development. It's completely left out of Manitoba's curriculum. So disability is actually not taught from a social model perspective, like you were talking about in curriculum. What is taught, though, is ideas in biology, like CRISPR, like talking about disability as if it should be something that, from a eugenics perspective, so disabled people should be wiped out, and that kind of goes into Peter Singer's philosophy, utilitarian philosophy. And so we need to have disability studies implemented more and more, and that's something that actually a little project that I've been doing is I wrote a course for the province of Manitoba, and actually wrote a course for the University of Manitoba in disability studies. So I teach disability studies to grade 10 to 12 students at my school, and then a few other schools. Another school division has also picked up my course, and I've worked with them, and they've been teaching it for a number of years. And so that's kind of what I would like to see. This is a long-term game. It's a big system. I'm not gonna. I wouldn't be doing anyone a favor by saying, well, we should just end this, or we do need to change. We need to change faster, and I think it goes back to the idea of priorities, right? And where are our leaders' priorities, and how are they implementing this change to better not only disabled students, but really all students?
And I will say, we were just speaking about that in our evaluation assessment class this morning with our after degree students. We were looking at alternative ways of assessment in classroom. We do have a class here on inclusive ed. I think that more so in our faculty anyway, we are really trying to take on more perspective of disability studies. I do think that it is a goal of ours here. And one thing though that I am going to mention, many of the teachers that I speak with who are really embracing inclusive education are really feeling a lack of support from administration, sometimes at a local level, at a provincial level. Because if we are to take the concept of inclusive education and do inclusive education as it is really meant to do, not just something where we are integrating students and calling it inclusive education. We need human resource supports. We need financial support. We need technological support. We need lots of supports in classrooms that support teachers to be able to do that. I think a lot of teachers that I speak to really want to embrace inclusive education. I think they believe in it. I think they see the benefit to all, but they really feel the burden of shouldering it all by themselves. And it is an impossible task. When you think about, for example, daycare settings where we have 4-year-olds, you got 4-year-old kids, 9 kids to 1 adult, and then we put them in kindergarten classrooms where there's 20 or 25 children to 1 adult, and you have a number of students with disabilities. What is a teacher supposed to do? So I really think that that's a big problem. And I think a lot of our teachers are embracing inclusive education, but very much feel unsupported in being able to do it effectively.
I want to thank everybody for coming on the show today. That was a great conversation. Michael, thanks for sharing some of your research and your knowledge with us. And Shelley, it was delightful to have you here with us.
I'm happy to. Such intelligent conversations.
So thank you very much. This is Leaning In and Speaking Out, the Research Connection podcast.
Thank you for having me.